Welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, Russia calls on NATO to hold an emergency summit over recent findings about September's explosion at the Nord Stream gas pipeline. Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova says there is plenty of evidence obtained by journalists on the blasts and the motive behind them. On Wednesday, American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh said U.S. Navy divers destroyed the pipelines on orders of President Joe Biden. The White House has dismissed the report as utterly false. Nord Stream pipeline sends gas from Russia to Germany. To discuss that further, we're joined by Greg Simons, researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies, who's joining us from Sweden. Also, we have with us Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author, joining us from London. Let's begin with our guest who is joining us from Sweden. Sir, were you surprised to hear this type of news surfacing after a couple of months? Of course, when the explosions happened, there were lots of speculations.
No, there was nothing surprising about it at all. In fact, American policymakers have been saying this is going to happen at some stage, way back to the time of Condoleezza Rice, who said that it was the US aim to ensure that Europe developed a dependency on American gas supplies rather than Russian gas supplies. Biden and Victoria Nuland both said if there is a physical war in Ukraine, and Nord Stream 2 will stop working. So these things are not a surprise at all.
So, Mr. Papadopoulos, how true do you believe these investigative journalists' reports to be?
Well, first of all, I should say this, that the Kremlin's call for NATO to investigate the act of sabotage against the Nord Stream pipelines will fall on deaf ears. Why? Because America is NATO and NATO is America. If the US one morning was to decide to leave NATO, then by the evening of the same day, the Western military bloc would no longer be in existence. In addition to that, the reason why NATO was established in 1949 was to, in the words of Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, to keep the Russians out of Europe, the Americans down in Europe, and the Americans in Europe. So it is not in the interests for the Americans to instruct NATO to investigate the origins of the explosions which rocked the Nord Stream pipelines in 2022. And given the amount of evidence, very persuasive evidence, which has been compiled by independent journalists, it is evidently clear that the Americans have a case to answer for. But alas, NATO will not investigate the matter. Last year, the Russians called upon the United Nations Security Council to investigate the explosions, but the Americans and the British blocked that, which was highly telling and highly suspicious. Perhaps the United Nations General Assembly can discuss the matter. But even if that was to happen, no action would be taken against America because, of course, America is a superpower. The Americans have used NATO to assist them in achieving mastery in Europe, which has enabled the Americans to achieve mastery in the world. So no matter how much concrete and persuasive evidence emerges indicating American guilt vis-a-vis the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, nothing will happen against Washington.
Well, nothing may not happen against Washington, but that will definitely adversely affect the relations that Washington has, which is already tense relations with Russia. So how do you believe that can affect the bilateral relations between the two countries? Are we going back to a Cold War status? Mr. Papadopoulos.
Well, relations Well, relations between America and Russia are absolutely atrocious. Yet, even though the Russians are aware that the Americans committed this act of sabotage against Nord Stream, the Russians understand that this matter will be effectively resolved on the battlefield in Ukraine. That is why the Americans attacked Nord Stream, to try and suffocate the Russian economy. If the Russians emerge victorious in Ukraine, which they will, then what happened to Nord Stream will just be another chapter in the very, very troublesome relationship between America and Russia. But we should also be aware that the attack on Nord Stream was not just an attack on Russia, it was also an attack on Germany.
Germany, exactly.
The Americans have been pressurizing the Germans for many years now to halt their import of Russian natural gas, and instead to import American liquefied natural gas. So again, that the Americans attacked Germany is yet another demonstration of how the Americans treat their own allies. Germany on paper is independent and sovereign, but in reality, the Germans are beholden to America.
Okay, so Mr. Simons, in your opinion, just as Mr. Papadopoulos brought up this very interesting point that this was not just an attack on Russian pipeline, this was also an attack on Germany, because they are the other end of this bargain. So how would that spell the future relations between the U.S. and Germany?
Well, what we've seen clearly during this Ukraine war and under Merkel, Germany was a vassal state of the United States. It had some small leeway of independent action in foreign and security policy. However, what we've seen under Schultz, Germany's become a client state. It has no will of its own. It is just mouthing exactly what Washington is telling it. And I mean, the Americans are clear about what their interests are. I mean, if we go back to Henry Kissinger, I mean, he laid it out perfectly, that this idea of a friend and foe in international relations, when he said that the United States has no permanent allies nor permanent enemies, it only has permanent interests. And this is exactly what we're seeing here at a point in time when the United States' unipolar hegemony is in relative decline. So these actions in Ukraine and Europe, and likewise in China with Taiwan, these are attempts by the United States to claw back their hegemony again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greg Simons, researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies from Sweden. Also, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author from London. Thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts with us.